Well, hey guys, today we are going to talk about Standard 3.4, the end of Reconstruction. I know it's Friday and I just gave you guys an assignment yesterday, so we're going to try to go through this quickly. I'm going to give you, I think, just one thing to do, unless I forgot something, and I'll tell you if that's the case in the middle of it, and then we will let you guys go. So we're going to talk about how Reconstruction ends today. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, Mr. Guy, we can't be done with Reconstruction because the war is over and the North is trying to get the South to accept the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they have clearly not done that. How can it be over? Well, that's a great question, and that actually takes us right to the very beginning of our content, because what we're going to talk about is how the end of Reconstruction really impacts the African Americans in the South, and the answer is very negatively because the South hasn't actually changed at all. So here's the deal. There are a lot of things going on in the country at any given time, right? So right now, while we have the coronavirus in 2020, we've also got issues with taxation, and the healthcare plan is in the Supreme Court, and we appointed a new Supreme Court justice that was super controversial, and all kinds of things are always going on, and it's the same back in the 1860s and 1870s. So first of all, we've got the country that continues to spread westward, and the government's trying to encourage people to go there, and they're trying to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll talk about in the next unit. All kinds of stuff is going on. The North goes through an economic depression that takes a lot of time and energy and resources in the North. And not only that, after the Civil War, because U.S. Grant is such a popular figure, he will be elected to be the president after Andrew Johnson. The only problem is the guy's a drunk, and he has never actually had a job other than the military, and he was a stockroom at his brother's general store. But other than that, that's it. That's all he's ever done. So Grant, though he might be a very nice guy, isn't really a great leader in many ways, at least when it comes to his own administration, and a lot of people are using his administration to get wealthy. The long story short is there's a lot of stuff going on that the country has to face. And on top of that, whenever we hear about what's going on in the South, it's lynchings, it's hangings, it's an immovable spirit that doesn't want to do anything different than what they've done forever. And so there's just less of a desire to enforce all these policies they had before. And so over time, Congress is slowly moving away from protecting the rights of freedmen. Well, this is going to continue sort of in a how do we get out of this sort of a situation right up until 1876. In 1876, we have two guys who are up for the presidency. On the left, you see a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. He's a Republican. And on the right is Samuel Tilden. And the best option here is clearly, well, neither of them. They're both pretty unexciting candidates. Samuel Tilden is the Democrat, but even though he's a Democrat, and he is sort of in support of the South, he also very clearly feels that the South was wrong in the war, and slavery should be over, and the South should accept all these amendments that they're fighting against. And so the South doesn't really love him, but they're mostly going to vote for him anyway. You say, wait, what about the black vote? Isn't the black vote supposed to make it so the South votes Republican? And the answer is, well, by now we've got all these things that are in place, all these, groups like the Klan and other folks who have been trying to mess with the black vote, trying to suppress it. And so a lot more Democrats are going to vote in this election than Republicans in the South. Well, it looks like Samuel Tilden wins this election, largely because of that. The problem is that there are three states in the South, I believe, and I should have checked before I recorded this, but I know it's Florida, I believe it's also Louisiana, and I think South Carolina, but I could be wrong, that the votes are still being tallied, but because they're southern states, everybody assumes they're Democrats. In fact, Rutherford B. Hayes tells people, I lost, the thing's over. And the Republicans are like, hold on, because we did some math, and if you happen to win these three states, you would actually win the presidency by one electoral vote. Now, the South is not really going to fight passionately for Samuel Tilden, because remember, they don't love him anyway. But there is something the South wants. The South wants the southern states to have the northern troops out of them. They're sick and tired of Reconstruction, basically. And so a deal is struck, and we call this deal the Compromise of 1877. So the election happens in November of 1876. There's not a clear winner in 1876. They continue to count votes. It goes into January of 1877. They actually didn't swear in a president then until, I believe, March. So January, February rolls around. We still don't know who the president is. And a deal is struck the week before the swearing-in ceremony where the Democrats say, fine, we will vote for Hayes in these 3 states if you get rid of the federal troops. This is the Compromise of 1877, and this is going to have a huge effect on the South. So guys, if you take the troops out of the South, who is going to protect African Americans and make sure they're not having to live by the black codes, they're treated equally under the law, and they have, at least the males, have the right to vote? The answer is nobody. Because of this, the Compromise of 1877, and 1877 specifically, is the end of Reconstruction. From this point on, the South can do what it wants to do, and it's going to take almost 100 years for African Americans in the South to really start making significant gains. The South feels like they have lost the Civil War, but won Reconstruction. So, there is something I'm going to have you add in the Padlet. I'll put that at the end, so just kind of hold tight. But it will be the Compromise of 1877, and I bet you won't forget what year that happened, would be my guess. All right, so now the Army's gone. The South is like, finally, we're going to take back what's rightfully ours. Well, there's actually a word that means to take back what is rightfully yours, and that is to redeem. If you redeem something, you're taking back what's yours. Well, the South, specifically Southern whites, feel like the government of the South ought to be theirs. They feel like they should be able to control their own destiny in the South, and it's time to get rid of those radical Republicans and those African Americans who are in Congress. So we have this group of people that call themselves the Redeemers, and the Redeemers are Democrats who are slowly but surely going to take back the Southern governments. Okay, these are racists. These are people that are like, yeah, we should be able to, take away rights from African Americans because that's what we did before. We just want to go back to that. This is what the Redeemers are. So, the 13th Amendment is basically toast. Yes, African Americans are free, but with the Redeemers in control, the black codes are certainly going to be held to. So what about the 14th Amendment that guarantees citizenship and equal protection for all? Well, let me introduce you to a guy. It's this guy right here. His name is Homer Plessy. So my question to you would be this. Do you think Homer Plessy is a white guy, or a black guy, or a Hispanic guy, or an Asian guy? I want you to take a guess here real quick. And the answer is, he's actually 7/8 white. And so in your mind, you're like, all right, so he's white. Not so in the South in the 1800s. In the South, if you're 1/8 black, you're actually called an octoroon. What they mean by that is you're 1/8 black. That's it. But because you're 1/8 black, you're not pure-blooded, and as a result, you're treated as an African American. So this is a problem because we are going to start to enforce these things called the Jim Crow laws, which you've probably heard of in the past. And these Jim Crow laws just say, well, if you're white, you can go to these places, and if you're black, you go to these places instead. We want to keep the races separate, they say. Homer Plessy, even though he's 1/8 black and 7/8 white, is going to have to do what all the black people do because separation of purebloods and all that kind of stuff. Very shades of Harry Potter here. Okay. Well, Homer Plessy doesn't like this, and so he does something that is super, super smart. In fact, Homer Plessy goes to a train car, a train station, and he buys a ticket, and he gets on the white train car, and nobody notices anything because look at him. Come on, that's Homer Plessy. The dude looks white. But he goes a step further, and he goes up to somebody on the train, a conductor or whatever, and he's like, man, it's kind of amazing that I can ride this train. Because my great-grandfather couldn't have. And they're like, well, why couldn't you? Was he like in a wheelchair? Like, what's going on? He's like, no, my grandfather was, actually great-grandfather was black. And they're like, oh, no, say it ain't so. Well, of course he is. So they basically say, you need to get off the train or we're going to have you arrested. And he's like, so arrest me. And they do. Now, so far, you're like, Galleon, you said he was super intelligent. It doesn't seem super smart if your day ends with you going to jail. But Plessy has a plan. See, he's going to sue. He says, my 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law was not given to me. Because of that, this law and all the Jim Crow laws are in violation of the 14th Amendment, and they should be struck down, which makes a lot of sense. However, the court hears him in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Supreme Court says it is okay to divide the races, to have separate races and separate facilities, as long as they are, quote, equal. Now, of course, they're never going to be equal. I mean, when we start talking about the schools in the South in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there's no comparison between the white schools and the black schools. Everybody knows that the black schools are the bad ones. They get the old cast-off chairs. They get the old cast-off textbooks. It's just not right. But this is what's going to be decided in Plessy versus Ferguson. Specifically, discrimination is illegal if states can prove the facilities are separate but equal. That's the phrase we're going to use, and it seems to be a clear violation of the 14th Amendment to me. In the 1800s, the Supreme Court disappeared. So now the federal government has left African Americans to fend for themselves by removing the troops from the South and said, hey, and if you want to treat black people differently just on the basis of their race, go ahead. The South is loving it. They think that this is fantastic because life is going to go back to the way it was before the war. We don't have slavery, but we have not slavery is kind of their plan. That's kind of their deal. You're also going to add Plessy versus Ferguson. I'll come back to this in a minute. So guys, the 13th Amendment pretty much dead because of the black codes. The 14th Amendment pretty much dead because of Plessy versus Ferguson. What about the 15th Amendment? What do we do about voting rights? Well, see, to keep African Americans from voting, the South is going to do two things. They say, we know that African Americans, we can't just say you can't vote because you're black, because the 15th Amendment prohibits us from doing that. So what can we... You're like, no, wait a minute. There are a couple things we know. We know that African Americans haven't been going to school because, the South made it illegal for a couple hundred years to educate African Americans. So there's that. And they're relatively poor because, we kept them in slavery and the sharecropping system doesn't allow them to grow economically. So, they're poor and they're uneducated. So why don't we make it so you have to pay a tax to vote? Oh, perfect. Poll tax is what we're going to call that. It's not a whole lot of money. But it's enough that if you have to decide between should I use this money to put food on the table or should I vote, you're probably going to decide for food on the table. On the other hand, I say, well, we're also going to do this thing called literacy tests. Okay, literacy tests are basically, they sound really good. You don't want dum-dums voting, right? The problem is, if you are responsible, and I'm talking about Southern white people, not you, but in the late 1800s, I hope not you, if they're the people who are responsible for African Americans at the time being uneducated, and you say, okay, based on education, you're not going to be able to vote because you don't have it. Well, that's pretty clearly racist. In fact, this cartoon here, I think is amusing. It says, education, qualification, and look, even his Q is like, he's put the little things on both sides because he wasn't sure which one. The black man ought to be educated afore he can vote with us whites, Mr. Solid South. The joke here is that there were a lot of really dumb white Southerners at the time, too, because remember, there weren't really public schools. The only people educating anyone in the South were the people homeschooling their kids, which usually were the plantation owners. A lot of dumb people in the South, and they're not all black. Here's the deal, though. The South wants dumb white people to vote. And so it does something that is really super problematic. They passed something called the Book of the Grandfather Clause, which says, okay, so you can't vote, but you want to vote. Well, here's the deal. We will let anybody vote if their grandfather could vote. So sure, maybe you can't pay the poll tax. Maybe you can't pass the literacy test because you're a dum-dum. Whatever, cool. So the only other question is, was your grandfather a registered voter? Easy question. Oh, one problem. African Americans' grandfathers couldn't vote because the 15th Amendment hadn't yet been passed. The South has a way to get around everything. Guys, let me just point this out really quick. There's a lot of discussion today about is the law biased against African Americans? Or another way to say that would be, is there such a thing as systemic racism? Now, there's definitely discussion to be had about to what effect is it there. But there's a lot of history in the United States, and specifically in the South, of systemic racism. People might say, no, we just want to make sure folks are educated. And, if their grandfather could vote, then whatever, that's cool, they can vote. Guys, there's a history of it. And so when you come across somebody who says that systemic racism is a thing, at least they have history on their side. Okay. Now, I'm not even answering, do I think it exists today or not? I'm just saying, when you look at U.S. history, there are plenty of systems that were designed to keep African Americans specifically in their place. And we're also going to see this with Chinese folks and Hispanic folks and other folks throughout the years. So just be aware, history is on the side of folks who say, yeah, there at least has been in the past systemic racism. So what's going to happen when black people aren't voting? Well, guess what? White Democrats start winning in the South. And they're going to pass more Jim Crow laws to make sure that segregation is a thing. And the Solid South is a term that's going to start to be used. Solid South just means we in the South vote solidly Democrat, all the southern states. And it's going to last for 100 years, well, almost 100 years. The problem with all this, well, there's so many problems with all this, but one of the outcomes of all this is that African Americans can't get hired at the new textile mills. They can't get hired anywhere else. Because they can't get the good jobs, they're stuck working in the fields. Poverty grows, especially as the value of cotton drops, because we're fighting other countries for the price of it. And a lot of African Americans start to move north for new opportunities. We're going to talk about this. Actually, it'll be next semester, but it's a thing. So 2 more things you're going to add to your timeline. These you only have to put the title and the date. And we'll talk about cartoons later. So really, really, really quick before I stop. There is also a true-false thing. I'm going to have you do the Padlet editions. There's a true-false thing. And if you are at all interested in seeing one of those literacy tests, because you're like, I think it's probably fair and it's a good idea, I'm actually going to post one here, and I'm going to make a separate video where I just go over some of the answers, not all of the answers, because it's like a 30-question test, but you can see if you would have or would not have actually passed it. Okay, so be on the lookout for that. It's coming real soon. Guys, take care. Have a good weekend. See you next week.